Well, hello and welcome to this brief presentation on fish passage and fish barriers in the Wet Tropics region. My name's Greg Vidal. I manage Wet Tropics Waterways, which is the Healthy Waterways partnership for the Wet Tropics region. And we've got a great interest in the health of our fish communities as a component of our waterways, and also, of course, about how easily our fish can move between estuaries and between the freshwater wetlands upstream, which is really, really important. So this presentation is going to be a quick overview of some of the key facts, I guess, about fish passage and fish barriers. So let's start the presentation by talking about diversity and endemism. So diversity is all about the number of different species we have, and endemism is about the number of species that we have in the wet tropics that aren't found anywhere else. Now, what's really interesting in the wet tropics is that we have the most diverse freshwater fish populations in the country. We've got over 80 species of freshwater fish, or fish that spend at least a good part of their lives in freshwater, but yet we've only got a fairly small number of endemic species, around about 8 or 9. Now that diversity means, of course, that the fish have very different habits. There's lots of different species, so lots of different requirements in terms of ecology and flow and all sorts of things. So I guess what we'll do is talk a little bit about some of those different movement types that we see in wet tropics fish, not just wet tropics, but all around the world really. So the first type of fish movement or fish migration that we see is a thing called Pathadromy. So Pathadromous fish are the ones that move around within the freshwater reaches, but they don't actually go into the estuaries at all. So they might be moving from one part of a river system into a wetland or some other part of a river system for the purposes of spawning, but they're not actually moving down into the salt. And a good example of a Pathadromous species is the sooty grunter. Now, in Queensland, and you see here I've got Queenslandish, so I come from down south and I've been in Cairns now for a number of years and I'm still learning the language, and particularly around fish. So in Queenslandish, the sooty grunter is sooty grunter, but in the North Queensland dialect, they're called sooties. Although I do hear them being called sooties in other parts of Queensland as well. So sooties. Now this is another fish that those who live in the wet tropics might know. It's the eastern rainbow fish to most Queenslanders, but to North Queenslanders, it's just referred to as bait, eh? And that A bit on the end there, that's really important, I found, because that denotes that I've said something really important or really profound, and so people should agree with me. So I'm going to use the A quite often throughout this presentation, A. The second type of fish movement or migration that we see is called Anadromy. And I should say that there are 3 more types of movement, and all of those fish that fall into these 3 categories are what we call diadromous fish. That means they move between saltwater and freshwater, or freshwater and saltwater at some stage during their life cycle. So anadromous fish, like this empire gudgeon, are the ones that have mature fish in the headwaters of the streams. They're breeding in the upper end of the rivers. They're spawning there. Either the eggs or the juveniles are being washed down the rivers to the estuaries where they hatch or grow, and as they mature, those fish then move up the estuary system into the river systems, and the mature fish move upstream once again to spawn and seed the population. So the empire gudgeon, it doesn't really have a North Queenslandish name because it's too small to eat and it's not particularly good for bait. But for we aquatic ecologists, this is a very special fish, in part because it's just so prevalent. It's common in lots and lots of different waterways. The biomass of this fish can be really high. It can be a really important component of our fisheries. So just because we can't catch them on a rod and line, or just because they can't be eaten, doesn't mean they're not important. And lots of aquarium folk love these fish, of course, because of their beautiful colours. This is a male in breeding colours, of course, so much more colourful than at other times of the year. The next type of fish migration we have is called Catadromy. Now, Catadromous fish do things the opposite way around. So Catadromous fish are the ones that mature in the freshwater, and the adult fish come from the freshwater. They migrate downstream to spawn in the estuaries or along the coasts. So a good example and an iconic fish, and there's quite a few of these, I'll go through a couple that people will probably know, but a good example is Lates calcarifera, which is, of course, for southerners is the barramundi, for Queenslanders is the barra, and for North Queenslanders is just baz, eh? Then we've got fish like Lujanus argentimaculatus, the mangrove jack to most Queenslanders, or just jack, say. It's another fish that breeds in the estuaries or along the coastlines, and the juveniles move upstream to the headwaters to grow out to become mature fish. Couple more Catadromous fish. We've got Coolea rupestris, the jungle perch, or JP. And then we've got Megalops cyprinoides, the Australian tarpon, otherwise known as tarpon. So there's a few Catadromous species that you might know from our wet tropics waterways. Moving on, we have another group of migratory fish called Amphidromus fishes. And a good example of these is Mugelcephalus, the sea mullet, or mullet. These are fish that don't necessarily migrate to spawn, but they do make mass movements between fresh and salt water. So you'll see big schools of mullet moving up and down the river systems between the estuaries and the freshwater, and they need that movement for a whole range of reasons, but it's not for spawning. Of course, there are some other types of mullet we see in North Queensland from time to time, but we won't touch on those. So let me talk about what it is that David Attenborough got wrong and how he led us astray. And it's probably a little bit of a misnomer to say that he actually led us astray, but I guess the classical David Attenborough videos that we've seen in the past tend to be those shots of massive fish jumping waterfalls to migrate upstream and spawn. These are North American fish, the salmon and the trout that move upstream. The adult fish have grown up in the sea. They've fattened up, they've conditioned up, they move upstream, they spawn in the headwaters, and then they die. The juvenile fish live in the headwaters for a year or two, then they get washed downstream to the estuaries where they grow a bit bigger and stronger, and then eventually they go out to sea to grow out to mature fish, and then the cycle continues. Now, the problem with that is that it's a Northern Hemisphere thing. So that's an Anadromous. If you think back to those different migratory patterns, that's what we call an Anadromous life cycle. And that's a Northern Hemisphere thing to a large extent. We do have some Anadromous fishes in Australia, but not that many. Typically what we have is Catadromous fish. So remember there, we're talking about fish that the mature animals live in the headwaters and move downstream to spawn, as opposed to those Anadromous fish where the mature animals live downstream in the marine environments and move upstream to spawn. So our Australian fish, just like our Coriolis effect, just like our back to front cyclones, our Australian fish have got their migratory patterns all back to front if you compare them with the Northern Hemisphere species. Now let's go back to our comparison between those northern species and our Southern Hemisphere species, because it's really important. So this is a Chinook salmon, and a mature Chinook salmon, when it migrates upstream, they can be a lot larger than this, but on average, around about 90 centimetres and 15 kilos. They get much larger, in fact, than that, but that's an average one. The smolt, on the other hand, that's the juvenile Chinook salmon that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. They're only about 4 centimetres or 5 grams, and they're washed down by the current. They can float down quite easily on the strong currents to the estuary without too much effort at all. Let's have a look at one of our Australian species, the barramundi. So, as I said, barramundi and our Catadromous species do things a little bit back to front. So the mature adult fish are up in the headwaters. They come down when the rivers are in flood to the estuaries, and they spawn and leave their eggs down in the estuaries, where the juvenile fish, which are only 5 centimetres and about 7 grams, they're the ones that have to migrate back up, not the adult fish. Now, this is obviously not to scale, because if it was, it'd look a bit like this. So I'm sure what you can see here is when you think about the fish that are swimming against those strong currents and jumping those waterfalls and making their way up to the headwaters, in the Northern Hemisphere, they're big, powerful, strong, muscular fish. They've got really strong burst speed, which means out of the blocks, they can get really fast and they can jump out of the water and leap great waterfalls. But then look at the Australian fish. They're tiny, they're feeble, they're weak, they're immature, and they've got to swim against that current to get upstream to where they can find safety. If they don't get upstream, then the survival rates are much lower because they're really open to predation and they really don't last very long in the estuary. So a large number of them won't make it unless they can get into the fresh water. So a fish barrier in the Northern Hemisphere might look something like this, a large waterfall, a large drop where the fish are leaping up, and eventually it gets to a point where it's just too high for them to leap, then it would be considered a fish barrier. But in the Southern Hemisphere, this could be a fish barrier because whilst the northern species might be able to jump 2 metres, 2.5 metres in height, our Australian species generally struggle with more than about 10 or 15 centimetres. So in fact, this I've just said is a fish barrier. In the Northern Hemisphere, this was constructed as a fishway, as a fish passage device to help fish get upstream. In Australia, a lot of our fish wouldn't be able to get up that just because of the currents and the water depth at those endpoints where the fish are supposed to move up. They'd just be too strong for our Australian fish. So this is what we call a physical fish barrier. In other words, they just can't climb it. It's too high, or it's too wide, or they can't get past it physically. But another type of fish barrier is a flow velocity barrier. So in this case, this particular example, this pipe, is actually both a physical and a flow barrier, I suppose, because they've got to get up into the pipe in the first place. But once they get into the pipe, what you have there is a long stretch of pipe that has a smooth surface and has constant flow all the way through it. Now, the juvenile fish, as they're migrating upstream, what they like to be able to do is swim in short bursts and then take cover behind a piece of structure that gives them a bit of a break from the current. They recover and then they swim another little burst. And so they move a little bit at a time. When you put them into a pipe system like this, they get part way up and then they get washed back down. Part way up, get washed back down. They don't have the stamina to get from one end to the other. So we call this a flow velocity barrier because the flow is too strong for the fish to get through. Then you've got things like biological barriers. Now, this is a noxious weed called hymenacne. It's present in the wet tropics. It can choke up waterways. It can make it difficult for fish to move. It can make it difficult for water to flow. And it can be just a general bit of a pain that does quite a bit of damage to our ecosystems. So that's a biological barrier. You can also have chemical barriers. If we have a really bad water quality issue, for example, that may be sufficient to stop fish from passing. So lots of different types of fish barriers. But a preliminary study that was done around about 10 years ago, which was at the time quite a good study, but using the technology of the time and using the limited resources that were available, identified around about 5,536 barriers in the wet tropics to fish passage. Now, the authors of that paper noted that it was probably an underestimate, and with what we know today and the technology we have today, we can say almost categorically that it is an underestimate. But as I said, we haven't done proper studies, and so we do need to figure that out. So there you go. That's a very quick overview of fish barriers for the wet tropics region. I guess I'll finish up by saying that now you know, if you hear me say I'm going out to check out a snag for Barra and Jack, you know I'm not talking about a barbecue with mates. So folks, that's it for this presentation. That's all, eh?